electricity, with many on the brink of survival. In yet another of a long list of attacks on human dignity, many civilians killed in Khartoum and Omdurman have been denied the right to a proper burial, their bodies still lying on the streets or in abandoned homes. The Sudanese Red Crescent reported that they recently buried 180 unidentified bodies across the country. Scores of families must now live with uncertainty over the fate of their loved ones. This is a crisis reverberating across an entire region. It is a powder keg. More than 2.1 million people have fled their homes, including 147 who have crossed into neighboring countries. Refugees and internally displaced people face abysmal conditions, walking for days in searing heat with very little access to food, water and shelter. Mr. Vice President, blatant disregard for international humanitarian and human rights law and utter indifference for human life and dignity lie at the heart of this conflict. I condemn in the strongest terms the ongoing human rights violations in the Darfur region. In West Darfur, the violence has now exploded along ethnic lines. Just last week, the governor of West Darfur was killed within hours of the RSF arresting him. At least 430 people were reportedly killed between 24 April and 13 May, most in El Janina. However, the actual number of people who have lost their lives as a result of organized and repeated large-scale attacks by the RSF and large numbers of their supporters targeting African inhabited neighborhoods in Al Janina is expected to be higher. We have been unable to verify the figures due to communications outages over the last month. As if that is not enough, residents of Al Janina have been cut off from vital services and supplies. More than 150,000 people have fled West Darfur into Chad. Yet those leaving Al Janina fear being turned back or further violations by the RSF, who have been controlling the route to the border. I repeat the call for a humanitarian corridor between Chad and Al Janina and for safe passage for all civilians out of the conflict areas. In North Darfur, recent clashes have resulted in the killing of more than 100 civilians. In the first week of June alone, 41 people were killed in the town of Khartoum, and in Nyala, South Darfur, and in Saringay, Central Darfur, heavy fighting has erupted at various times since the start of the conflict. In both cities, most premises belonging to the UN and international non-governmental organizations were looted. Mr. President, this is a human rights and humanitarian crisis that is unfolding at an alarming rate, on a devastating scale, and with a complexity not seen before in Sudan. Every day, children are bearing the harrowing consequences, with more than 13 million across the country in urgent need of life-saving humanitarian support, including 5.6 million in Darfur. At least 620,000 are reported to be suffering from acute malnutrition. At the Migoma Orphanage Center in Khartoum, 71 children reportedly died due to severe shortages of humanitarian and medical supplies. It is an unfathomable tragedy. Many children have since been evacuated. Medical supply shortages are also affecting nursing homes. In Khartoum North, my office has heard disturbing reports of 10 older men and women dying because they did not receive assistance in time. Without delay, the parties to the conflict must protect the organizations seeking to evacuate children and older people to a safer place where their needs can be met. I'm appalled by allegations of sexual violence, including rape. My office has received credible reports of 18 incidents of sexual violence related to the conflict against at least 53 women and girls. The victims include at least 10 girls. In one case, 18 to 20 women were reportedly raped in the same attack. In almost all cases, the RSF has been identified as the perpetrator. There is little access to medical and psychosocial support, and many cases remain unreported. As I did when I met him in November last year, I call on General Dagalo again to ensure that these vile acts stop immediately. We continue to receive reports of enforced disappearance and arbitrary arrests of civilians. At least 394 people have been reported as disappeared from the Khartoum area alone, including 16 women and 12 children. The total number could be much higher. Disappearances have been reported in Khartoum, Darfur, and North Kordofan. Reliable sources tell us that many may be being held by the RSF. I welcome the recent release of 2 Sudanese doctors held incommunicado, one by the RSF, one by the SAF, and call for the immediate release of all civilian detainees. My heart goes out to the human rights defenders, the lawyers, the journalists, and others who have stayed behind, many of whom I had a chance to meet in November last year. I admire their courage. Defenders, particularly women, are facing mounting threats, including death threats. Journalists and media professionals are also encountering threats and hate speech. Some have been directly targeted on social media, accused of supporting the RSF and threatened with death. Many others have been arbitrarily arrested or held incommunicado. Some have been released, but there is no information on the whereabouts of many. Mr. President, I welcome the new 72-hour nationwide ceasefire that was agreed on 17 June and urge the 2 parties to respect their commitments to halt the fighting and to allow the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout the country, so much needed. The new ceasefire is a new opportunity to put an end to this sea of suffering. I remind the 2 parties of their obligations to respect international humanitarian and human rights law and to take all measures necessary to protect all civilians, including humanitarian and medical workers, from harm. I also call on the authorities to conduct prompt, thorough, impartial and independent investigations into all alleged violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. I remind them that failure to pursue accountability for past grave violations has contributed to the current crisis. To break the cycle of violence, impunity must end. To the governments and people that have shown great humanity in welcoming refugees seeking safety from this vicious conflict, thank you for your solidarity. I urge all countries receiving refugees to keep your borders open. And in the spirit of international solidarity, I call on Member States urgently to scale up funding for humanitarian organizations who are desperately trying to assist the internally displaced, the refugees, both inside and outside Sudan, and also deliver humanitarian assistance. As we speak, there is a pledging conference going on the humanitarian front, so I hope that this pledging conference will fulfill the expectations of the people of Sudan. I would also like to add that I welcome this Council's decision to strengthen the mandate of my designated expert on Sudan to include detailed monitoring and documentation of the human rights situation, including violations arising directly from the current conflict. Mr. President, 4 years ago, the people of Sudan rose up to demand their rights, driven by a desire for a transition from dictatorship to peace, freedom and safety. They ousted the tyranny they had endured for decades and began to walk the path to justice and freedom. As we know, their journey was short-lived with the October 2021 military coup and now the gruesome conflict that has gripped the country for the past 9 weeks. Millions of lives have been shattered and uprooted, and Sudan is now again engulfed by bleakness and the bottomless grief of the far too many who have lost children, parents, and loved ones. Ushering in a lasting peace demands our utmost attention. The violence must stop today. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank the High Commissioner for his report, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hassan Hamid Hassan for his presentation. Excellency, you have the floor.
شكرا جزيلا السيد الرئيس. أرجو التأكيد أولا أن
Thank you, Chair. We are sitting today as from our seat, not as a member of the Council. We're attending as a party to the dialogue. We still stand against the decision S36/1 by the Council regarding a special session on Sudan. Mr. Chair, 2 months and 5 days, and the rebel forces have been going to great lengths to breach international humanitarian law and international human rights law, occupying hospitals and health facilities that have become a target for rebel forces. And we have sent 3 official memos to the WHO, and we are asserting that the number of hospitals and health facilities that have been occupied or turned into garrisons by the rebel forces now total 39 hospitals and health facilities. Chair, the systematic destruction and plundering of public facilities and public service facilities has continued, including utilities, as well as the destruction of depositories of history and civilization, including museums and research centers and libraries and universities. 2 months and 5 days, and UN entities are still speaking the same gray language, pointing at 2 warring parties. 2 months and 5 days, and the rebel forces have been occupying the houses of citizens and evicting them forcibly to such an extent that the neighborhoods of the greater Khartoum have become as good as vacant and completely in the control of the rebel forces. Even the headquarters of embassies and international organizations have not been spared from the occupation, vandalism, plundering, and looting. And every day that passes by, there is no message clearly from the international community against the rebel forces as they continue with their breaches. They continue those breaches because they're not receiving any form of accusation or denunciation or condemnation from that international community, because the UN is still not calling a spade a spade. And the statements and decisions from the UN entities, including this Council, are still very timid, which is an extraordinary contradiction, because there's an attempt to equate between a national army and rapid support forces, RSF. And the question is, if a national army does not have as a duty combating such a rebellion, then the question also is, what is the purpose of national armies by virtue of constitutions and the principles of the UN Charter to preserve national security and sovereignty? 2 months and 5 days, there have been 8 temporary ceasefire agreements signed and humanitarian truces through the Jeddah pathway. But every time the rebel forces have been breaching and breaking those agreements because they know that no fingers will be pointing at them to accuse them of such acts. They know that the fingers will be pointed at 2 parties in such an unjust and misleading characterization. This mischaracterization is what has led the rebel forces to continue with their atrocities in West Darfur and its capital Al-Janina. And you've all seen the atrocity of the murder of the governor, Khamis Adam Abkar, may he rest in peace, as detailed in the report of the High Commissioner. And here I have to mention the statement by the spokesperson of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights regarding this event. And we should describe it as the first statement that calls a spade and that assigns responsibility to the rebel forces. And this is something that the Office of the High Commissioner should be commended for. Mr. Chair, the texts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are being breached flagrantly and systematically by the rebel forces. And it is sufficient what we've heard just now from the High Commissioner. And just 2 days ago, we have sent the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights the latest update by the Unit Against Violence Against Women regarding the latest numbers of violations, because the abductions and sexual violation are increasing, in addition to the operations of invading residential places and looting them. With regard to West Darfur, enough to say that El Janina, which is the capital, and the larger villages have been plundered totally, as we've heard from the governor before he was abducted and killed. And the contradiction, Mr. Chair, is that the perpetrators are depicting and documenting their atrocities and posting them in various media, while some UN entities are still hiding behind gray language and hesitating before sending out a clear and direct message condemning the rebel forces and calling them to stop their atrocities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Belash for his presentation. Excellency, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman. Mr. Vice President, High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I thank the Honourable Human Rights Council for having invited the African Union to participate in this enhanced interactive dialogue on the report of the UN High Commissioner on Sudan. The African Union considers that this meeting is nothing less than a demonstration of support to Sudan. We are not here to judge. We are here to help. That might go without saying, but it's worth saying. I would like to reiterate on behalf of the African Union our support to the kindred people of Sudan in distress in this delicate situation, whose hallmark is a deadly kindred clash between two military entities, giving rise to, sadly, a tragic humanitarian situation, as well as destruction of civilian infrastructure, and giving rise to a real threat to peace and security, which in the whole area of the Horn of Africa, the African Union played a role in bringing about the transition based on consensus in August 2019, and the African Union firmly rejects the option of a military solution to this crisis and advocates in favor of seeking a political solution based on consensus through a inclusive and transparent political dialogue. Thus, through the leadership of His Excellency Moussa Faki Mahamat, who is the President of the African Union Commission, an enhanced or enlarged mechanism was set up involving international partners who are affected and interested in the situation in Sudan. A African Union roadmap, including a de-escalation plan and the need to bring about a ceasefire and to open up humanitarian corridors and mapping out the main sequences that a national dialogue should follow. This African Union roadmap has been agreed. The African Union supports fully mediation brokered by Saudi Arabia and the United States of America to bring about a humanitarian ceasefire and a cessation of hostilities to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population. The tripartite mechanism bringing together UN, IGAD and African Union and the other members of the international enlarged mechanism are all getting down to the task of guaranteeing better coordination between its members to ensure that there is no fragmentation of efforts and no multiplication of initiatives in order to create a harmonious synergy, which will be the hallmark of the guarantee for the success of what we do. I'm referring here to trilateral cooperation, namely UN, AU, IGAD, the Quad, that is US, UK, UAE, Saudi Arabia, the European Union, the League of Arab States, the Troika, US, Norway, UK, the neighbouring countries, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Libya, Central African Sudan, South Sudan and Chad, P5, you know them, the A3, that is Gabon, Ghana, Mozambique, as well as Kenya, Turkey and Qatar. Mr. Vice President, as far as human rights are concerned, everybody agrees on the fact that the most basic human rights have been violated, namely there is murder, violence, theft, rape, disruption of private property and destruction of civilian infrastructure. The Council must give itself the means to carry out an investigation to ensure that the authors of these violations are brought to justice, be held accountable for what they've done. The protection of human rights and the protection of international humanitarian law cannot happen if there is no peace and no national reconciliation, which is why the African Union is calling for the strengthening of international solidarity for there to be peace in this country and ensure this country is back on track to bring about a democratic transition which leads to free elections so that this crisis does not lead to civil war and chaos in the sub-region. Finally, on behalf of His Excellency, the President of the African Commission, I would like to reiterate his determination to do everything he can, together with our international partners, to diligently implement the African Union's roadmap, also supported by the international community. We reiterate our full determination to cooperate positively with your honourable institution, and I thank you now for your very kind attention.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. And now I give the floor to Ms. Inaz Muzamil for her presentation. Madam, you have the floor.
Yes. Thank you so much. Mr. President, High Commissioner, Excellencies and colleagues, good afternoon. Let me start with a statement. The war that rages in Sudan since last April is not a civil war. It's a war between two factions of the Sudanese militaries. Neither of them represent anybody or anything except their own business interest. That is to say their despicable greed to loot the country and exploit the resources that belongs to the Sudanese people. The Sudanese people have nothing to do with this war except that they have to pay the price. The Sudanese people who impressed the world by bravely standing up against the dictatorial regime that had been oppressing them for 3 decades, demanding civil rule, and now this bitter experience is what they get. At this point and at this moment, the war atrocities continue in Khartoum, Darfur and North Kordofan. The city of Al Junaina in Darfur subjected to a genocide with a systematic killing of its citizens by RSF militias. The horrors and fear experienced by the people there are beyond imaginations. The governor, after courageously expressing his protest, was brutally assassinated a few days ago. Coming from Khartoum, let me focus on the situation there without disregarding the fate of the Sudanese people elsewhere in the country. The neighborhoods of the capitals are controlled by the RSF, who evict people from their houses, intimidate and humiliate them, loot their possessions, and subject women to sexual abuse and violence. Especially the security and safety of women is at stake. Several cases of rape and sexual slavery have been documented, and the people in Khartoum now know that it's only the tip of the iceberg. These crimes are carried out by young soldiers. They are recruited, brainwashed, and transformed into killing machines who rape women in front of their husbands and families. The streets of the capitals in the state of anarchy. The armed gangs of criminals looting shops and houses and robbing citizens. The scarcity of electricity, water, and food. There virtually no health care. With RSF have occupied the large number of hospitals in Khartoum to care for their wounded ones. Meanwhile, the army is hiding in their barracks, targeting the RSF in the neighborhoods with their superior weaponry. The citizens of Khartoum live in continuous fear of air bombardments and heavy artillery. Hundreds of people have been killed and injured by arbitrary bombs and of the Army Air Forces. The streets of some neighborhoods are littered with corpses, underlining the contempt of the human lives and dignity of the human of the greedy generals. The stench of the rotting corpses is everywhere and penetrate even homes. In these homes, citizens are powerlessly waiting their fate and struggling to survive. Hundreds of thousands have fled the city, but most have stayed because they lack the means to run safely. Or because they are stubbornly refuse to give up their homes to the warring parties and looting criminals. Life in the capital and elsewhere in the country have come to a standstill due to a war that has no explanation except for greedy ambitions of the two men who put their personal interest over the interest of the Sudanese people. How can these generals expect to rule Sudan with any degree of legitimacy after they subjected the Sudanese people to this nightmare and destroyed their country's infrastructure? I call on the international community, politicians, decision makers, to put strongest possible pressure, including sanctions, to the war generals to stop this war and to return the political process towards civil rule. I call them to support Sudanese human rights activists in providing help to the Sudanese people and in documenting war crimes and human rights violation, and to hold those responsible accountable for their crimes against the Sudanese people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions of the presenters and to make comments on their statements. I give the floor first to Ms. Louis Amsberg, Commissioner for Human Rights of Germany, by video.
Mr. President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner and the designated expert for their briefings. Our special session on Sudan and the resolution we adopted was a wake-up call. Unfortunately, it has not been heeded yet. The human rights situation remains dismal. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands injured. The impact of the conflict on civilians is deeply worrying. Sexual and gender-based violence has increased fourfold since the fighting erupted. Humanitarian needs are at an all-time high and keep increasing. Attacks on humanitarian operations are unacceptable and must stop. The same is true for the needless bureaucratic barriers such as the need for travel permits for humanitarian staff. The conflict threatens the safety and security of the people of Sudan as well as the unity and stability of the country. We urge all parties to immediately end hostilities without preconditions. International human rights law and international humanitarian law must be respected, including through allowing rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Germany supports all dialogue and mediation efforts to end the conflict and return to the aspirations of the Sudanese people for a peaceful, stable, and democratic future.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Bronte Moles, Australian Ambassador for Human Rights.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia thanks the High Commissioner for his update and report. The human rights situation in Sudan, as documented in the report, has deteriorated significantly following the outbreak of armed conflict on 15th of April. Despite the commitment of the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces on 11th of May to protect civilians, we are deeply distressed by the ongoing violence, which has led to hundreds being killed and thousands more injured. It's regrettable that negotiations on a permanent end to hostilities have not progressed, and we urge parties to prioritise dialogue. We are deeply concerned by reports of ongoing human rights violations, including sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by both parties, reported attacks on humanitarian workers, and the appropriation of health facilities are inexcusable, as is the reported recruitment and use of children. The longer human rights abuses continue, the harder it will be to deliver lasting peace. Australia asks what more can regional organisations and neighbouring states do to help protect civilians and bring about a permanent end to hostilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lithuania on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honor to deliver the statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We thank the High Commissioner for the update and echo the grave concern over the crisis in Sudan. Reported cases of unlawful killings, including of children, arbitrary detentions, sexual and gender-based violence continue to be worrisome. We are concerned over the increasing number of refugees, internally displaced persons, and millions of Sudanese in need of humanitarian aid and protection. We strongly condemn all violations and abuses of international law, as well as a decision to expel the head of UNITAMS, Mr. Volker Perthes. We call on all parties to the conflict to immediately cease violence and put the interest and safety of the people in Sudan first. We urge the belligerents to engage in an African-led political process under the auspice of the African Union in order to find an immediate, peaceful and sustainable solution to the conflict. We firmly believe that the cessation of hostilities, protection of human rights and accountability should remain central and contribute to the resolution of crisis in Sudan. Mr. High Commissioner, how can the international community best support the protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all persons in Sudan? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU remains gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Sudan. Since the conflict began, hundreds of people have been killed and thousands injured. The impact of the conflict is deeply worrisome, with increased levels of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as targeting of civilians and civilian settlements on the basis of perceived ethnic or social identity. The humanitarian needs are at an all-time high, and the political crisis and the continued fighting have drastically reduced the options for an operational response to these needs. The EU strongly condemns the fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, which fundamentally threatens the safety and security of the people of Sudan, as well as the unity and stability of the country with potentially grave regional implications. We once again appeal to all parties to silence the guns and immediately end hostilities without preconditions. A sustainable ceasefire is an urgent and overdue imperative. The EU also calls on all actors to allow and facilitate rapid, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access. Mr. High Commissioner, the EU supports efforts that seek ways to support dialogue and mediation in order to end the current conflict and facilitate a return to the path of democracy. All efforts must respect the aspirations of the people in Sudan for a peaceful, stable and democratic future with respect for human rights and the rule of law at its core. Contribution of the High Commissioner and the designated expert in this regard is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The OIC member states remain concerned over the security situation in Sudan, resulting in loss of innocent lives, injuries to thousands, and dire humanitarian situation. We renew our solidarity with the Sudanese people at this difficult time. The OIC reaffirms its support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Sudan. We call on all parties involved in the conflict to exercise restraint and continue peace efforts aimed at preserving the unity of Sudan and meeting the aspirations of its people for political and economic stability. We attach utmost importance to the maintenance of ceasefire and provision of humanitarian assistance across the country. In this regard, we welcome the Jeddah Declaration. It provides a solid foundation to bring peace and stability. We call on the international community, including humanitarian organizations, to uplift their efforts to provide livelihoods and also assist Sudan's neighboring states. suffering from conflict in Sudan and have kept their borders open for accommodating those fleeing the conflict. We acknowledge Sudan's consistent cooperation and engagement with this Council, OHCHR, and the human rights expert. This commitment was well demonstrated through arrangement of the human rights experts' visit to Sudan at the beginning of this year. We urge OHCHR to continue to provide technical assistance to Sudan and help in strengthening capacities to meet in international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman on behalf of Gulf Cooperation Council.
Thank you. I deliver the statement on behalf of the member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The GCC countries take note of the report of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sudan and express their concern about the violence raging in the country, which resulted in aggravating the human rights situation there. We affirm our position on preserving the security, safety and stability of Sudan, maintaining the cohesion of the state and its institutions, supporting Sudan and stressing the need for de-escalation, giving priority to the language of dialogue and unity, and alleviating the suffering of the Sudanese people. The GCC countries are making huge efforts by organizing humanitarian bridges, evacuating civilians, and meeting emergency humanitarian needs. We urge the international community to provide more urgent humanitarian and medical assistance to meet the needs of the Sudanese people and prevent the humanitarian situation from worsening. The GCC countries will spare no effort to restore the security, safety, and stability of Sudan. We welcome the Jeddah Declaration and the relentless diplomatic efforts made by KSA and the United States of America to enable the Sudanese political forces and party to de-escalate, give priority to the language of dialogue, and bring points of view closer. Such agreement will spare the Sudanese people the scourge of war, conflicts, and will protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Lebanon on behalf of a group of Arab states.
السيد الرئيس يشرفني تقديم هذا البيان.
Thank you, President. I have the honor of taking the floor on behalf of the Arab Group. The Arab Group follows with concern the changing situation in Sudan, and we express our full solidarity with this country and its people during this difficult period. We reaffirm the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Sudan. We place great importance on the ceasefire and access to humanitarian assistance. We welcome the declaration of Jeddah on the mediation between the US and Saudi Arabia. We look forward to putting an end to the conflict and helping the people face the challenges and receive humanitarian aid. We hope to make it possible for humanitarian aid to be delivered to the victims of the current conflict. We call on the international community to provide aid for humanitarian assistance and development, and to welcome more displaced persons and refugees, and to help IDPs be welcomed and hosted inside Sudan, as well as laying the groundwork for free elections. It is vital for the Sudanese institutions to remain intact and free. It is vital for the state concerned to be agreed before any new mandate is put in place or the existing mandate is renewed. We welcome the cooperation of Sudan with human rights mechanisms, and we call for technical assistance of all forms to be rendered to the country to help protect human rights. Thank you.
To the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire on behalf of a group of African states.
Monsieur le Président. Mr. President, I have the honor of making this statement on behalf of the Africa Group. The Africa Group expresses its solidarity and support for the Sudanese people. We remain convinced that stability must be protected for development and human rights. There is a key principle that the Africans must be responsible for their security, and we support the efforts by IGAD. We have seen efforts towards a ceasefire including negotiations between the parties. Our group calls on the parties to the conflict to find new solutions on the basis of consensus. We express our deep gratitude to neighboring countries for their efforts that they have deployed to keep their borders open, to welcome and provide assistance to those fleeing conflict. We have brought all necessary support to ensure a peaceful transition. We welcome the cooperation between the Sudanese government and human rights mechanisms, and we look forward to this cooperation continuing. We also would like to ask of the High Commissioner to continue to provide technical assistance to Sudan, with the consent of the country concerned, which is fundamental. We support the territorial integrity, independence and sovereignty of the country, as well as the need to protect human rights, even in times of war. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States of America on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. Vice President, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of the Quad members, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, and United States of America. We express our deep concern about the catastrophic human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan. We urge the warring parties to fully respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and to agree an effective and sustained ceasefire to ensure safe, rapid, and unhindered humanitarian access. The warring parties must uphold their commitments under the Jeddah Declaration to protect civilians of Sudan. Their fighting endangers the lives, livelihoods, and human rights of the people of Sudan. Many cannot access food, safe drinking water, health care, or reliable information. Women and girls are particularly vulnerable. Sudan's rich cultural patrimony is at risk. The Quad stands by the people of Sudan at this difficult time. We implore the warring parties to resolve their differences peacefully, protect civilians, return to an inclusive political dialogue process, and intensify coordination with the Sudanese civilian stakeholders who must be the authors of their country's future. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. This statement is on behalf of the core group on Sudan, Germany, Norway, the United States and the UK. We condemn the Sudanese authorities' move to declare SRSG Volker Perthes persona non grata. We continue to support him, and we urge Sudan to cooperate fully with his mandate. The human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan as a result of this conflict has deteriorated even further since the recent special session of this Council. Every day there are new allegations of human rights violations and abuses and violations of international humanitarian law by both parties to the conflict that have driven mass displacement within and out of Sudan. We are particularly horrified at reports of increasing ethnic-related violence and sexual and gender-based violence in parts of Darfur. Mr. President, we stand in solidarity with the Sudanese people, and we condemn this conflict and the violations and abuses that it has led to. We call again for an immediate, complete, and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire. As ministers meet today to pledge their support for the humanitarian response in Sudan and neighbouring countries, we urgently call for full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access, protection of civilians and full respect for humanitarian principles. Sudan must return to peace, stability and transition to civilian government through an inclusive political process. Anything less is a betrayal of the Sudanese people.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States of America on behalf of a group of countries.
Vice President, I'm delivering this statement on behalf of my country and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as facilitators of the Jeddah Declaration of Commitment to Protect the Civilians of Sudan. Saudi Arabia and the United States stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan and call on the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces to reach agreement on a ceasefire. We urge both parties to commit seriously to facilitating humanitarian assistance and the restoration of essential services desperately needed by the Sudanese people. The facilitators stand ready to resume formal talks, but only once the parties demonstrate their will to uphold their commitments under the Jeddah Declaration. The United States and Saudi Arabia stand by the people of Sudan and urge the parties to end the fighting immediately. There is no acceptable military solution to the conflict. Besides engaging with the parties, the facilitators continue to coordinate with regional and international partners to stop the fighting and minimize its impact on the region, and to intensify coordination with Sudanese civilian stakeholders who must be the authors of their country's future. Sudan's transition must be civilian-led and deliver on commitments to justice, prosperity, and peace for the Sudanese people. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Egypt.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. تتابع.
Thank you. Egypt follows closely the changing situation in Sudan, and we offer our full solidarity with the brotherly people of Sudan, with which we maintain historic relations through our geographical proximity. We hope for the security and political situation in Sudan to be stabilized with rapid responses to humanitarian needs. We hope to see an immediate comprehensive ceasefire in order to ensure that the state institutions and authorities are protected. We continue efforts to allow the people of Sudan to freely cross borders and gain the medical assistance, humanitarian assistance they need. We have hosted around 250,000 refugees, including 10,000 from other nationalities. We encourage the UN bodies active in the humanitarian area, as well as other bodies and sponsors, to provide urgent assistance in order to reduce the suffering of the Sudanese people and to help neighboring countries to increase their capacity to welcome refugees and IDPs. We note the importance of conferences such as that in Geneva between sponsors, and we reiterate the importance of gaining the consent of host countries before mandates are expanded or renewed, particularly noting that there is a history of cooperation between UN mechanisms and the government of the country. We hope to protect human rights further. Thank you.
To the distinguished representative of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you, Mr. High Commissioner and Mr. Nwise, for your briefing. On behalf of the United States, I express today grave concern about the human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan. The human toll of this conflict is devastating, and it merits this Council's continued attention. Reported violations and abuses must be fully investigated and perpetrators held accountable. We are alarmed by reported armed forces, resulting in significant civilian casualties. All parties to the conflict must fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law. There must be full, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access so that the aid being pledged today in Geneva can reach those who desperately need it. I reiterate Secretary Blinken's statement in support of Sudanese civilian stakeholders to lead a political process to restore Sudan's democratic transition and form a civilian government. A democratic government led by civilians is best positioned to protect human rights. We stand with the people of Sudan who are working to achieve this aim. Mr. Nwise, how would you characterize the reports you are receiving about human rights violations and abuses in Sudan? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to UN Women.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The violations of women's and girls' rights in Sudan continue to worsen. Women have been killed, raped, disappeared, and assaulted. Many have been forced to displace and migrate. The ongoing fighting affects humanitarian agencies' ability to deliver aid to women and girls. The health, food security, and livelihoods of women are currently under extreme stress. Excellencies, UN Women continues to be in contact with Sudanese women inside and outside Sudan. Their message is clear. International and regional actors must put pressure on all parties to stop the conflict, deliver gender-responsive humanitarian assistance, protect the rights of women, including displaced and refugee women, and investigate the violations of women and girls' rights, in particular conflict-related sexual violence. There must be no impunity, and every instance of sexual and gender-based violence must be investigated and prosecuted without exception. It is crucial to listen to women and girls from all regions of Sudan as they articulate the complex security and humanitarian realities. To do so, UN Women supported the organization of a solidarity meeting on 12th of May with the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and others that mobilized support to Sudanese women. Additionally, UN Women is providing humanitarian assistance targeting women's specific needs. UN Women is ready to work with member states to ensure that the rights of Sudanese women and girls are protected. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We've heard the report on the human rights conditions in Sudan, and we're following up on the conditions in Sudan, and we are working with the brotherly peoples and nation of Sudan during this scourge. And based on what we have reviewed, we are calling on taking a firm position in support of the unity, stability, and territorial integrity of Sudan. In this regard, we would like to renew our support for the Saudi-American initiative as well as IGAD's regional initiative, and we hope that these initiatives will succeed in achieving tangible progress that puts an end to this crisis as soon as possible. Mr. Vice President, the state of Qatar at the governmental and non-governmental levels has spared no effort since the beginning of this crisis in supporting the brotherly Sudanese people by establishing an air bridge to support those affected. This includes humanitarian development, food and medical assistance, as well as evacuation operations, and the efforts are still ongoing. Mr. Vice President, standing with the people of Sudan is a moral duty and a joint responsibility of the international community. In this connection, we look forward to the success of the high-level pledging conference to support the humanitarian response in Sudan, which my country co-chairs. And Qatar has pledged $50 million to respond to the urgent humanitarian needs of the Sudanese people.
Now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement presented by the European Union. We thank the High Commissioner and the human rights expert on Sudan for the clear report, and we welcome all of their efforts which have led to the release of a number of political prisoners. We thank the authorities in Sudan for their cooperation with the United Nations human rights mechanisms during the last period. Nevertheless, the report documents deeply concerning violations and abuses of human rights. These pale, however, before the abuses perpetrated against civilians since fighting broke out between the troops of Generals al-Burhan and Hemeti. We call on the parties to the conflict to instantly and fully meet their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure that the ceasefire is made permanent, to establish humanitarian corridors and to protect civilians from the effects of fighting. Women and children must be protected from gender-based and sexist violence, and survivors must have access to essential services. Women defending human rights must be able to do their work without fear of reprisals. Finally, declaring the Special Rapporteur of the Secretary General, Volker Perthes, as persona non grata is unacceptable. Mr. High Commissioner, Mr. Expert, how can this Council respond to the extremely serious violence perpetrated by the Rapid Response Forces against ethnic groups in Western Darfur? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative
Mr. Vice President, Belgium aligns itself with the EU declaration and joins the strong condemnation of the ongoing fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. I thank the High Commissioner for the report. This is a regular product of a recurring resolution. However, there is nothing regular or normal in the horrific human rights situation that Sudan finds itself currently. The curve of ever-rising humanitarian needs, including for the urban population, is unfortunately also keeping pace with increased levels of conflict related to sexual and gender-based violence. We face a tragedy. The courageous women of Sudan have stood up for freedom and equality back in 2019, and now, today, they need protection against violence. The quest of the people for sovereignty, the rule of law, and democratic order must be at the core of our efforts and cannot be held hostage by armed forces. From this viewpoint, Belgium insists on the importance not just of a ceasefire and peaceful settlement through mediation based in the region, but also and above all a prospect and a realistic pathway towards the restoration of civilian rule and democracy in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
Thank you very much. At the outset, my country's delegation aligns itself with the statements issued by the groups to which it belongs and takes note of the report of the High Commissioner assisted by the appointed expert. We take this opportunity to highly appreciate Sudan's continuous cooperation with the international mechanisms of human rights, which reflects its commitments to relevant international conventions and instruments. We also commend the serious steps taken by Sudan on the path of democratization. Although the report under consideration covers the period preceding the events currently taking place in Sudan, however, we would like to express on this occasion our deep concern about the repercussions of the armed conflict and non-compliance with the ceasefire, so that there is no further deterioration of the basic human rights situation in Sudan, with increasing cases of internal displacement and asylum in neighboring countries. The state of Kuwait calls for the need to comply with the international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and the need to cooperate with international humanitarian agencies to enable them to provide assistance to those affected. We call on the parties to de-escalate and exercise restraints and give priority to the voice of wisdom and engage in peaceful dialogue with the aim of political stability, economic recovery for the advancement of Sudan and its people, and thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Japan appreciates the report and the presentations. We are deeply concerned about the worsening security and the human rights situation in Sudan. Japan urges the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to maintain the ceasefire and reinitiate the transition to civilian rule in the country. We appreciate the mediation by the United States and Saudi Arabia to date toward a ceasefire and the decisions made at last week's IGAT summit toward achieving peace. We'll continue to actively engage in the constructive framework with like-minded countries and regional organizations. Japan is providing humanitarian assistance in response to the situation in Sudan. We announced a total of $3.5 million in humanitarian assistance to Egypt, Chad, and South Sudan last month, and also last week we decided to provide a total of $5 million in aid to Sudan. Japan will continue to contribute to the improvement of the human rights situation in Sudan through efforts to stabilize the situation in Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks the High Commissioner for his report. We are deeply concerned by its findings. The people of Sudan are confronted with continued violence, discrimination, and atrocities. We commend the people of Sudan for their incredible courage and resilience in their demand for a peaceful and democratic future. We are shocked by the ongoing and worsening violence against women and girls, which is unacceptable. We urge Sudanese authorities to promulgate a zero-tolerance policy for sexual and gender-based violence, to end all forms of discrimination and violence against women and girls, and to ensure their meaningful participation in public affairs. For a peaceful future, a vibrant and diverse civil society is indispensable. The Netherlands applauds Sudan's civil society organizations for their courage and their resilience. Their work is essential for accountability, humanitarian aid, and giving youth in Sudan a voice to shape their future. Mr. High Commissioner, how can the international community continue to support civil society organizations that are active in Sudan under these difficult circumstances? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Chair. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement and shares the deep concern about the human rights situation in Sudan following the outbreak of hostilities on April 15, which caused an unacceptable death toll and almost 2 million among internally displaced persons and refugees in neighboring countries, further exacerbating the already dire humanitarian situation in the region. Italy reiterates the strongest condemnation of the ongoing fighting between the Sudanese armed force and the rapid support forces, and calls on all actors involved to cease the armed confrontations, safeguard civilians and stop immediately any attack on critical civilian infrastructures. We also reiterate our call to urgently enable rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. In order to achieve a lasting ceasefire with a view to swiftly resuming a political dialogue and to establish a transitional civil government, Italy reaffirmed its support to all mediation efforts, including the ones by the United Nations, the African Union, the League of Arab States and the regional quartet within IGAD. We also commend the joint efforts by the US and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that enabled preliminary ceasefire initiative over the past weeks. Italy continues to stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan and support its aspiration for a future of peace and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Monsieur le Président. Mr. Vice Chairperson, we thank the High Commission and the experts on the human rights in Sudan for their respective presentations. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Sudan, which is the first victim of the clashes in Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, two generals who were fighting over power after a coup. Instead of giving the power back to the people, the regional organizations, the UN and my country and many other international NGOs are all mobilized to respond to the crisis. We welcome the efforts made by all efforts of countries who are mediating this Council of Strengthening the mandates of the OHHR and the Special Rapporteur at a special session on the 11th of May. A humanitarian conference for Sudan and the region organized by Saudi Arabia in particular is happening today in Geneva. In order for these efforts not to be vain, it is the responsibility of both parties to ensure that their troops respect the commitments signed in Jeddah on the 11th of May for a ceasefire and for the humanitarian corridors. The truce decided on the 18th of June for 72 hours seems to hold, and we express our wish that it continues and even becomes a permanent and respected ceasefire. As underscored by Mr. Nussi on the 9th of June, this situation remains critical. The civilian populations, including women and children, are victims of indiscriminate violence and sexual and gender-based violence. The violence in Darfur is particularly worrying because of its scale, and it's based on ethnic violence. This is a setback for peace in Sudan and transition towards civilian government. In addition to exacerbating a humanitarian situation which is already precarious, and as well as the mass increase of number of IDPs and refugees, all this threatens to destabilize the region. Today, we very much regret the decision of the government to call for the departure of Mr. Volker Perthes.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We thank the High Commissioner and the other speakers for the report and the updates on the situation of human rights in Sudan. The devastating impact the recent resumption of the conflict has had and continues to have on the human rights of the people in Sudan is deeply concerning. A conflict fought between rival political and armed groups can under no circumstances provide a justification for violence against the civilian population, including targeted attacks against public venues such as marketplaces, as well as incidences of mass rapes by troops in uniform. We reiterate our call for the respect of international human rights and humanitarian law and ensure protection of civilians and their human rights and fundamental freedoms. Parties to the conflict must ensure that violations are effectively and independently investigated and perpetrators held accountable for their actions. This is the only way sustainable peace can be achieved. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia. It seems to be an error on the list. We'll move on to Spain. Spain, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Spain is grateful for the report of the High Commissioner and adds its voice to those that what was said by the EU nationally. Spain deeply deplores the ongoing existence since the 15th of April of the violent clashes between the armed forces of Sudan and the rapid support forces, which have given rise to a significant number of dead and injured, as well as the forced displacement of over 1 million people, with serious consequences for the unity of the country and regional stability. We express our deep concern about the dramatic humanitarian situation worsened by the various clashes, as well as the resurgence of the inter-ethnic conflicts inter alia in the areas of Darfur, Kordofan, and other areas. There are serious violations of human rights committed by both sides, including inter alia, the recruitment of minors, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, which is widespread, as well as the attacks against the humanitarian workers and health and education centres. We support the efforts which, under the leadership of the AU and other international regional actors, work to achieve ceasefire and unhindered access to humanitarian aid, especially for the vulnerable population, with guarantees for the protection of civilian population. We consider that it is urgent that we resume the negotiations with an inclusive national dialogue and the necessary mediation for establishing a democracy and laying the foundation for lasting to fight against impunity and accountability for the abuses and committed human rights violations. How can the international community, Mr. President, support efficiently a inclusive national dialogue and the establishment of accountability mechanisms? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain.
Thank you. First of all, my delegation would like to align itself with the statements made by the political and regional groups to which it belongs. We also take note of the report of the High Commissioner. Mr. President, the successful mediation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United States of America resulted in the signature of the Jeddah Agreement, which is an important step in terms of de-escalation and stopping bloodshed among united people, to avert the humanitarian ordeal suffered by civilians and return to the political track to resolve the crisis in preparation for a better future for Sudan under the principles of international law. My country supports Sudan and will spare no effort in helping the country. We also hope that the Jeddah Agreement will constitute an important step on the road to a permanent cessation of armed conflict and a comprehensive peaceful settlement through the participation of all parties in an inclusive national dialogue that meets the aspiration of the Sudanese people and achieves security, peace and prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Canada thanks the High Commissioner for his report. Canada shares the concerns of the High Commissioner regarding the worsening human rights and humanitarian situation in Sudan and the devastating impact of the conflict. Since the conflict began in April, there has been an alarming rise in attacks against civilians and humanitarian actors. Credible reports of human rights violations and abuses are also deeply concerning, including sexual and gender-based violence against marginalized groups and women, human rights defenders and their families. Their protection and participation in the political process is critical in order to resolve the crisis and ensure a lasting peace. In solidarity with the people of Sudan, Canada has repeatedly urged all parties to respect human rights, to comply with their responsibilities under international human rights and humanitarian law, and to cease all forms of violence against civilians. We continue to advocate for African-led solutions to the crisis and urge all parties to engage in regional and international mediation efforts. Canada stands firmly with the people of Sudan and their demand for peace and civilian-led government. We continue to call for the inclusion of the Sudanese people and civil society in efforts to resolve the crisis. Mr. High Commissioner, how can the international community support the respect for human rights and meaningful inclusion of civilian voices in the resolution of this conflict? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, Vice-President. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We reaffirm the fact that only through genuine dialogue and cooperation, which are fundamental pillars of the work of the Council, will we be able to improve human rights protection. Human rights cannot be addressed via selective impositions of mandates against countries of the South, much less when they do not have the support of the country concerned, which is when they are designed to fail. We welcome the uninterrupted cooperation by the government of Sudan with this Council and its mechanisms. In July 2022, it underwent a successful third UPI by accepting the great majority of the recommendations received. At the end of last year, it received a visit with the High Commissioner, and at the end of 2023, the designated expert. It is the Sudanese people itself, without foreign intervention, that should lead the way towards reconciliation with those of us who are committed to peace. In that respect, we support the initiatives launched by the AU and the IGAD to bring about understanding in Sudan. We hope that the country itself will be able to take the political decisions it needs to take to bring about political stability. Finally, we urge Sudan to make progress on the path of political dialogue and reconciliation to achieve lasting peace that will enable the country to steer a clear course towards full development for its people that will bring well-being and prosperity to its people. Thank you.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. At the outset, the delegation of the Republic of Iraq associates itself with the statements delivered by the political and regional groups to which it belongs. My delegation has reviewed the report prepared by the High Commissioner for Human Rights with the assistance of the Special Expert on Human Rights in the Sudan. We commend the spirit of cooperation exhibited by the brotherly nation of Sudan in working with the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms, despite the challenges the country faces, and we express our full solidarity with Sudan and its people at this difficult stage. Iraq calls on the international community to support initiatives aimed at reaching a lasting political solution and leading to the formation of a Sudanese government that achieves the aspirations of the brotherly Sudanese people. We also call for the continued provision of humanitarian assistance to Sudan to mitigate the repercussions of the humanitarian crisis. Iraq welcomes the Jeddah Declaration, which is an important step to protect civilians, facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid, and avoid escalation in order to preserve civil peace and serve the interests of our brothers and sisters in Sudan. In conclusion, Iraq reiterates its position calling for a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire, stressing the need to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Sudan, while refraining from interference in its internal affairs by dealing with the Sudanese crisis as an internal affair, thus avoiding actions that might further fuel conflict, threaten regional peace and security, and endanger civilian lives. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malaysia aligns itself with the statement of the OIC and remains deeply concerned with the current situation in Sudan. Notwithstanding, Malaysia commends the efforts made by various parties in facilitating the political dialogue and welcomes the signing of the Jeddah Declaration. In this context, Malaysia calls on all parties to uphold the maintenance of peace, security, and stability by honoring commitments therein. We urge for the protection and safety of civilians as well as unimpeded humanitarian assistance. We hope that necessary safeguards are prioritized by the authorities to continue ensuring the rights of vulnerable groups, including women and children. Malaysia encourages Sudan to continue engaging with UN human rights mechanisms, including the UNHRC's expert and its office in Sudan and the UN in the Human Rights Unit within UNITAMS. We also encourage the Council to continue providing technical support towards ensuring accountability and the promotion and protection of human rights in accordance with the aspiration and priorities of the Sudanese government. Malaysia remains in solidarity with the people of Sudan and stands ready to facilitate efforts towards peace and stability in their country. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Let me start by thanking the High Commissioner for his report, and both him and Mr. Nusser for their continued efforts to improve the human rights situation in Sudan, efforts which are all the more important given the current tragic conflict. You have our full and unequivocal support. Mr. President, the situation in Sudan is a catastrophe. The behaviour of the two main parties to this wholly unnecessary conflict is unacceptable, with indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas in Khartoum, targeted civilian shootings in Darfur, and the repeated violation of every single agreed ceasefire by both sides. We stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan and their demands for urgent humanitarian access, as well as for peace, democracy, justice and civilian government. We call on the entire international community to press the parties to the conflict to stop this senseless violence, agree and respect an immediate, unconditional ceasefire, come together to begin the hard work of rebuilding Sudan, and ensure, finally, but importantly, the full respect for the human rights of all Sudanese people. High Commissioner, what opportunities do you and Mr. Nusser see for ensuring the various initiatives launched to address this conflict are inclusive, constructive and complementary? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa aligns itself with the statement of the African Group. My delegation wishes to thank the High Commissioner for the report and acknowledges the Sudanese government's cooperation with his designated expert, which we hope will continue. While the report covers the period preceding the current conflict, many of the human rights concerns identified have been exacerbated since then. South Africa therefore expresses its solidarity with the people of Sudan who have been subjected to unimaginable suffering and applaud the initiatives undertaken to bring this to an end. As part of this process, we underscore the importance of a single, inclusive peace process for Sudan and welcome the AU's establishment of the expanded mechanism for this purpose. We also commend the role of the high-level delegation of IGAD, the roadmaps adopted by the AU and IGAD, together with the efforts deployed by Saudi Arabia and the United States in this regard. In so doing, we emphasize the importance of continuing to uphold the principles of complementarity and subsidiarity, ensuring that those most affected take the lead. Accordingly, South Africa joins with others in calling for the parties to agree to and fully implement a ceasefire, to facilitate unhindered humanitarian access, and to resume the political transition process towards a democratic civilian-led government. We similarly echo others in calling for the parties to embrace dialogue as well as a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The guns must be silenced once and for all, as the Sudanese people deserve no less. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and thanks the UN High Commissioner and other briefers for their reports. Malta is deeply concerned by the human rights situation in Sudan and deplores the loss of life and targeted attacks on the civilian population, human rights activists and humanitarian workers, as well as the associated personnel and humanitarian actors working within the UN. We echo the High Commissioner's call to stop the excessive use of force and for independent and impartial investigations into all such human rights allegations. We are also appalled by the reports of sexual and gender-based violence and calls upon both parties to the conflict to take all necessary measures to take preventive measures to protect the vulnerable. We urge the belligerents to cease hostilities immediately, allowing space for the resumption of a credible and inclusive political transition process. We support regional and international stakeholders, including the African Union and the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sudan, to achieve these ends. Finally, Malta reaffirms its support to African leadership and takes note of the African Union roadmap for the resolution of the conflict in Sudan. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. Vice President, Aotearoa New Zealand welcomes the report and oral update provided by the High Commissioner with the assistance of the designated expert on human rights in the Sudan. We note that the period of reporting predates the current conflict engulfing Sudan, which has exacerbated an already fragile human rights situation. We urge the parties to the conflict to adhere to a lasting ceasefire. This will help to alleviate human suffering and enable Sudan to restart the transition to civil government as envisioned by the Political Framework Agreement of December 2022. The overall human rights situation in the country, as outlined by the High Commissioner, is alarming. The continued instances of the use of excessive force, unlawful killings, torture and ill treatment in detention, and sexual and gender-based violence remain deeply concerning. We call upon Sudan to implement effective accountability measures for human rights violations. As the report notes, many of those suffering at the hands of joint security forces are ultimately released without charge or upon dismissal of charges. Without effective accountability, it is difficult to envision an improvement in the human rights situation in Sudan. We ask the High Commissioner, how can the international community help to facilitate a transition to civilian government centred on human rights and accountability? Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The HRC should sincerely engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation when addressing the human rights issue in the countries concerned, refraining from any biased and politicized approach, including attempted interference in internal affairs and pressure under the pretext of human rights. Any approach without consent and cooperation of the country concerned could not lead positive development. Thus, this only undermines the credibility of the HRC. DPRK stresses on the importance of giving priority to existing national and regional mechanisms to resolve the crisis on the basis of the principle of African solution to African problems, and that expansion of initiative by other parties is counterproductive. We emphasize its continued commitment to respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence, and political unity of Sudan, as well as the importance of the dialogue and cooperation in the field of promoting and protection of human rights. We urge HRC to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with the state, carry out work based on its mandate in an objective and impartial manner, and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. We wish Sudan a democratic and peaceful future. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the High Commissioner for his update. Prior to the most recent outbreak of conflict, Sudan was already facing severe human rights and humanitarian challenges. Now the situation is dire. We are alarmed by reports of attacks on civilians on grounds of ethnicity, as well as increases in conflict-related sexual violence, particularly in Darfur. We echo the call of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide for the prevention of atrocity crimes in Sudan for alleged atrocities to be investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. Ireland underscores the obligations on the parties to the conflict to respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, facilitate humanitarian access and protect health and humanitarian workers. We urge them to agree an immediate ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. A way forward must then be found that ends the cycle of impunity, as clearly demanded by the people of Sudan. As over 1.9 million people have fled the violence, the international community must also consider its protection responsibilities, ensuring the right of non-refoulement, granting asylum and support for provision of essential humanitarian assistance. High Commissioner, how can the international community address increasing violence with an ethnic dimension and prevent commission of atrocity crimes? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Vice President. Turkey has aligned itself with the OIC statement. In addition, we would like to welcome Sudan's close cooperation and engagement with the Council and the Office of the High Commissioner. We will continue to take into account the views and the commitments of Sudan in the process ahead. For Turkey, security, well-being and prosperity of brotherly Sudanese people are central, and this principle guides all our efforts. We believe it is only through dialogue and reconciliation that the crisis in Sudan can be brought to a lasting solution. Therefore, our efforts to find a negotiated solution will continue. At the same time, we fully support the initiatives led by African Union and IGAD. Enhancement and adherence to a ceasefire and ensuring unhindered humanitarian access across the country are among the most pressing imperatives. Ultimate goal is the establishment of a civilian-led government. An inclusive political process should replace the current cycle of violence. Mr. Vice President, we will continue to stand by the people of Sudan, also through the provisions of humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. China has taken note of the report of the High Commissioner to the current session, as well as the position paper issued by the permanent mission of the Sudan a few days ago. Despite the complicated domestic environment, the Sudanese government remains committed to protecting human rights